Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 6 deeply unsettling stories from small-town bars, those dimly lit, wood-paneled places at the edge of nowhere where locals have been nursing the same drinks and the same secrets for decades. These are accounts from people who sat down for a quiet beer and walked out carrying something they were never supposed to know. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from tonight. Story 1. There's a bar in Cutter's Hollow, West Virginia that doesn't have a sign anymore. Used to have one painted wood, letters faded to almost nothing, but it blew off in a windstorm maybe 15 years ago and nobody bothered to put it back up. The locals just call it Harmon's, after the family that's run it for 3 generations. The building is squat and low, pressed into a hillside like it grew there, the kind of place where the ceiling fans turn so slow they barely push the cigarette smell around. There's a pool table with a warped rail on the left side and a jukebox that still plays actual 45s if you feed it quarters. My Uncle Daryl used to take me there for lunch when I was a teenager, a burger and a Coke, while he had a few beers after his shift at the mill. I loved that place in the way you love something that feels like the opposite of everywhere else. So when I found myself passing through Cutter's Hollow on a Thursday night in late October, I was driving back from a job interview in Charleston, took the scenic route to clear my head, one of those decisions that seems fine and then somehow costs you 2 hours. Stopping at Harmon's felt like running into an old friend. I was tired. The interview had not gone well. I think I just needed somewhere to sit that didn't feel like a highway. I pulled into the gravel lot around 8:30, maybe 9. There were 4 other vehicles there, 2 pickups and a sedan with a cracked tail light and what looked like a child's snow boot sitting on the hood, which I noticed and immediately forgot about, the way you do with small strange things when your mind is already somewhere else. Inside, it smelled exactly how I remembered. Cigarettes and spilled beer, and something underneath that, something old like the wood itself, was slowly composting. The Garth Brooks song on the jukebox was a little too slow, like the mechanism was running low. 2 men I didn't recognize were playing pool without talking, and an older woman sat at a booth with a crossword puzzle and a glass of white wine that seemed about as out of place as a chandelier. The bartender, a big guy named Chet with a beard that had gone mostly gray, gave me a nod and poured a draft without asking. I sat down at the bar. That was the thing I remember most clearly, choosing the stool. I sat at the 3rd stool from the left. There were 8 stools, and the one at the far right end, separated from the others by maybe 3 feet of empty bar, had a glass on it, just a glass, nothing in it. I thought maybe somebody had just stepped out. I drank my beer. I ate the peanuts from the little wooden bowl Chet slid toward me. I started to feel the tension go out of my shoulders. I wasn't scared yet. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing wrong. I was just a person at a bar having a beer on a Thursday. Somewhere around my 2nd drink, the door opened. I didn't turn around right away. You don't at a bar like that. It's somebody's father. It's a regular. You let them settle before you look. But I noticed Chet go very still behind the bar, not tense exactly, just still, like a man who has decided not to react to something he has already reacted to once before. I looked over my shoulder. There was a man walking toward the far end of the bar. He was tall, not basketball tall, but tall enough that he had to angle slightly as he passed under the low-hanging light fixture near the pool table, though when I think back on it, I don't remember him actually ducking. He was dressed in work clothes, dark green jacket, dark pants, heavy boots, and he moved with a kind of careful deliberateness, like someone who had recently hurt a knee and was trying not to favor it. He sat down at the stool at the far end, the one with the empty glass. He folded his hands on the bar and looked at Chet. Chet didn't pour him anything. For a few minutes, I just drank my beer. The pool game behind me resumed. The crossword woman turned a page of her puzzle book. I told myself it was nothing. Two guys who knew each other had a thing, some old argument, some bar tab grudge. Not my business. Then I looked up at the mirror behind the bar. The mirror at Harmon's is long, smoky, mounted crooked, so one edge dips lower than the other. I had been using it to watch the pool game the way you do. I looked at it now to glance at the man at the end of the bar. He didn't have a reflection. And I know how that sounds. That the stool at the end of the bar appeared empty in the mirror. The glass sat there. The bar surface reflected the overhead light. The stool showed, but the man sitting on it was simply not in the mirror. I put my beer down. I looked directly at him. He was there, solid, real, hands folded, jacket slightly damp at the shoulders like he'd walked through mist. I looked back at the mirror. Empty stool. I did this maybe 3 times, turning my head back and forth, and I'll be honest with you, I kept trying to find the angle I was missing, some trick of the old glass, some spot where the silver had flaked away. I must have been obvious about it, because Chet walked over to me and leaned on the bar and said quietly, without looking at the man, "Don't look at him too long." "What is he?" I said, and even as I said it, I felt stupid for asking. Chet shook his head, just once, the way you shake your head when the answer doesn't exist or when you've given up trying to find it. I paid for my beers. I left most of the second one. As I stood up and reached for my jacket, I made the mistake of glancing down the bar one more time. The man had turned his head to look at me. His face it was a man's face. That's the thing. It wasn't monstrous. It was a regular face, plain and tired-looking, with dark eyes and a 2-day beard. But the angle was wrong. His face had turned to look at me, but his shoulders hadn't moved at all. His neck had rotated about 30 degrees further than necks rotate, and he was watching me with what I can only describe as a patient, settled kind of attention, like I was something he had all the time in the world to look at. I walked out. I didn't run. I walked, and I got in my car, and I drove for 40 minutes before I stopped shaking enough to feel safe pulling over. 3 days later, I found a handprint on the passenger window of my car, on the inside of the glass. I had been alone when I drove that night. I've thought about it a lot over the years. I've tried to find a reason for what I saw. I've never been back to Cutter's Hollow. I heard Chet retired a couple years ago and somebody bought Harmon's and turned it into a storage unit. I hope that's true. I hope whatever was sitting at the end of that bar doesn't have anywhere to go anymore. But I don't think it needs a place to sit. Story 2. The summer I turned 24, I spent about 3 months doing seasonal work up near Ashwick, Minnesota. A nothing town built around a grain elevator and a Lutheran church, and a bar called the Mill Pond Tap that served as a kind of social center, town hall and grief counseling service all at once. The place had a screened porch that jutted out over an actual drainage ditch, which froze in winter but in summer smelled like creek water and whatever the farms upriver were running off. The owner, a woman named Berta Haglund, had been pouring drinks there for 30 years and knew things about everyone in a 20-mile radius the way a priest knows things, not because people told her, but because they talked around her until the shape of the secret became obvious. I was there with a soil remediation crew. 5 of us, contracted to assess some old agricultural contamination on the east side of the county. The work was repetitive and physically exhausting, pulling core samples, logging measurements, wading through chest-high grass in waders that never dried completely. We'd come into the mill pond most evenings around 6, sit on the porch, drink more than we should have, and drive the 15 minutes back to the motel in varying states of competence. I'm not proud of that part. I'm just being honest about what those weeks looked like. Anyway, this happened on a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday. I've tried to pin it down and I can't. My coworker Denise had driven into town to get an alternator belt for the truck, and 2 of the other guys had stayed at the motel with food poisoning from a gas station burrito, which they deserved. So it was just me and Marcus, our crew lead, sitting on that porch drinking mediocre tap beer and watching a thunderstorm build up on the western horizon. Marcus was the kind of person who talked a lot when he was nervous, and not much otherwise. That night he was quiet, which should have registered with me but didn't. I was watching the lightning, counting the intervals. The porch light was yellow and attracted moths, and every few minutes one of them would hit the screen hard enough to make a sound. Marcus ordered a basket of fried cheese curds and left most of them untouched. I ate about half. The storm got closer. The drainage ditch below us started to smell more strongly. Not bad exactly, just more present, more earthy. Around 9, a man walked up the exterior stairs onto the screened porch. Old guy, I thought at first, white-haired, heavy around the middle, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He chose the table in the corner, the one behind a support post where the screen had a long horizontal tier patched with electrical tape. I remember thinking someone should fix that properly before winter. He didn't look at us. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the porch door, and Berta came out with a glass of water without him asking. "Regular?" I asked Marcus. Marcus looked at the man for a second. "Don't know him," he said, which I found mildly odd, since Marcus had been coming to the mill pond for 6 weeks and seemed to know at least half the county. We went back to our beers. The storm rolled in. The sky went from purple to green, and the whole town got very quiet in that way it does right before the wind changes. No crickets, no frogs, just the tin roof overhead flexing slightly in the pressure drop. Then I noticed the man's hands. He had put them flat on the table, palms down, and I noticed them because he had spread his fingers very wide, wider than fingers usually spread. And he was pressing them into the table surface with what seemed like real effort, like he was trying to hold something down or hold himself down. His fingers were too long. I don't mean a little too long. I mean the proportion was wrong, like someone had taken normal hands and stretched them at the fingertips, so that each finger was maybe a knuckle and a half more than it should have been, and they tapered to points that weren't quite fingernails but weren't quite not fingernails either. I nudged Marcus. He saw it. He picked up his beer very slowly and took a long drink. The man turned his head and looked at us. His face was old, deeply lined, heavy brow, the kind of face you de-paint in a church if you were painting someone ancient and tired of the world. But his eyes were the pale silver white of birch bark, and they didn't move the way eyes move. They didn't track. They oriented the way a camera orients, and then they fixed. And while they were fixed on me, I had the feeling of being looked at from a very great distance by something that was looking at many things simultaneously. Berta came back out with a menu nobody had asked for and set it on our table, which she had never done before, because we always ordered at the bar. She didn't look at the man in the corner. She looked at me and said, in the most casual tone she could manage, "There's a back way out through the kitchen if you boys want to head home before the storm hits." We went through the kitchen. I left my jacket on the back of my chair. When I went back the next morning to get it, Berta was already open. My jacket was on the bar. In the breast pocket, there was a single crow feather, glossy black, about 6 inches long. I had never owned a crow feather. The pocket had been empty when I sat down the night before. I know because my pen had been in there and it had irritated me that there was nothing else to put it next to. I kept the feather for a while. Then I threw it away. I'm not sure that mattered. Marcus quit the job 2 days later and drove home to Duluth. He didn't tell any of us why. He texted me one thing before he stopped answering his phone. "Don't go back on Tuesdays." I never figured out what that meant. I've turned it over for years. I still don't know. Story 3. The thing about Perdido Springs, Texas, is that it doesn't want you to stay. I don't mean that in some mystical sense, I mean it in the practical sense that there's nothing there. One gas station with one pump. A hardware store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the Carter administration. a Baptist church on the east end of Main Street, and a bar called the Trough on the west end, which I always thought said something about the town's actual priorities. I ended up there because of my grandmother's house. She passed in March, and the estate had dragged on for months, wills, cousins arguing, a disputed savings account, the usual ugly arithmetic of grief. I drove down in August to do the final walkthrough before the property sold, and I planned to be in and out in a single day. I had a return flight booked. I had a bag packed for one night just in case, and I told myself I absolutely would not need it. I needed it. The real estate contact I was supposed to meet never showed. His office said he'd had a family emergency and could someone else cover, and then there was scheduling confusion. And by the time it was sorted out, it was nearly 6 in the evening, and I'd been sitting in my grandmother's empty house for 4 hours with nothing but the sound of the ceiling fan and my own thinking for company. The house felt wrong without her furniture, smaller somehow, and the smell was different, dust and something sweet underneath that I couldn't identify and eventually stopped trying to. So I went to the Trough. Of course I did. It was a Wednesday in August at about 6:30, which meant it was still brutally hot outside and the bar's air conditioning was doing real emotional work for everyone in it. There were maybe a dozen people there, ranchers mostly, from what I could tell, and a table of younger guys in the back who looked like they worked construction. The bartender was a heavyset man named according to his belt buckle, which read TOMAS in silver letters. He had a gold tooth and very kind eyes, and he poured me a whiskey without asking what brand because there was only one brand on the shelf that wasn't for special occasions. I sat there for maybe 2 hours. Tomas told me about the flooding they'd had in spring, how the creek behind town had jumped its banks and taken out the old Ferreira property's fence line. The construction guys in the back argued about baseball with the enthusiasm of people who had been at it since at least noon. An older woman by the window played a game on her phone with the sound on, and every few minutes it made a cheerful little chime. I ordered the enchiladas. They were good. I told myself the day hadn't been a complete waste. Around 8:30, a girl came in and sat down 2 stools away from me. She looked about 17, maybe 18. She had dark hair pulled back and was wearing a t-shirt from a high school I didn't recognize and jeans with dried mud on the knees. She put her elbows on the bar and looked at Tomas, and he set down the glass he was drying and looked back at her for a long moment before he walked over. He didn't give her anything. He just looked at her, and she looked back at him, and then she turned and looked at me. "You're staying at Camilla's house," she said. My grandmother's name was Camilla. "I was," I said. "Just for the sale?" She nodded slowly, like this was complicated information. "She used to leave the light on in the west window," she said, "at night, so that it could find its way back to the creek." "What could?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked something slightly stupid. "The thing that comes up from the creek." She said it the way you'd say the mailman or the neighbor's dog, matter of fact, established, a thing everyone should already know. I'll be honest, I laughed a little. Nervous laugh. And I said something like, "She never mentioned that." The girl shrugged. "She wouldn't have wanted to scare you." She slid off the stool and left, and I noticed she hadn't ordered anything and I hadn't seen her come in a car. Tomas came over and refilled my whiskey unbidden. "Does that happen a lot?" I asked. "You should leave the west window light on tonight," he said. I almost argued with him. I almost said something sensible about how I was an adult, and this was my grandmother's house, and there was obviously some local legend at play here that I wasn't privy to. But Tomas had the same look Chet had once had back in West Virginia, that Stillwater look of a man who has run out of explanations and is now working only from survival instinct. I went back to the house. I turned on the west window light. At some point in the night, I woke up. I think it was around 2 in the morning, to the sound of something moving through the scrub brush outside the window. Not fast, not panicked, measured, and then it stopped, and I heard something like a long exhale, not human, lower than human, like the sound a barn makes settling in cold weather but coming from something alive. It lasted a long time, and then it receded toward where the creek would be. In the morning, I found a mark on the exterior window sill, not a handprint, not a claw mark. A smooth indentation, like something had rested its jaw there, or its brow pressing against the glass. The pressure had cracked one corner of the pane, a single clean line radiating out like a compass needle. I was on the road by 7. The property sold 6 weeks later. I never found out if the new owners knew to leave the west light on. Story 4. I used to work the closing shift at a place called the Copperhead Tavern, which was set back off a 2-lane highway about 12 miles outside of Elk Creek, Oregon. The owner, a man named Philip Osai, had bought it as a retirement project and poured more money into it than he'd intended, and it was actually a nice place. Knew a bar top, proper draft lines, a menu that went beyond wings and fries. But 12 miles from town is 12 miles from town, and no amount of nice bar-top laminate changes that math. We did okay on weekends and limped through the week. My schedule was Tuesday through Saturday, 4 to close, which usually meant I was locking up around 1 in the morning. I'd been doing it for about 8 months. I knew the regulars, knew who drove what, knew which couples were having problems and which old-timers were just lonely, and which of the younger crowd was going to need a ride called before last call. I was good at the job. I liked the job, which surprises people when I say it now because of how it ended. This was a Friday night in November, which should have been busy. It was not busy. A rainstorm had come in off the coast and just parked itself over the valley, the kind of rain that isn't dramatic, just relentless and gray and depressing. By 10 o'clock, I had 3 customers. An older man named Walt, who always sat at the end of the bar nearest the door and nursed 2 pale ales over the course of 3 hours. A woman named Priya, who worked the overnight shift at the logging mill office and came in on her dinner break to eat an actual dinner, instead of whatever was in the break room vending machine. And a young guy I didn't recognize who'd come in shaking rain off his jacket around 9 and ordered a burger and a Coke, and then sat at a table by the window playing something on his phone. Normal Friday. Quiet, damp, a little slow. Around 11, Walt went home. Priya finished her chicken sandwich, left me a good tip, and went back to the mill. The young guy with the phone had wandered out maybe 10 minutes before that without me noticing him go, which was fine. I started my closing checklist. I was running the glass washer, wiping down the bar, half listening to the rain. The front door opened at 11:20. 4 people walked in, 3 men and a woman. They were the word I keep coming back to is matched. They were dressed differently, wearing different clothes, different ages apparently, but there was something uniform about them that I noticed immediately and couldn't name. The way they moved, maybe. The way they arranged themselves at the bar, 2 stools, then a gap, then 2 more stools with a kind of deliberate spacing that didn't feel social. I told them we were near closing. The woman at the far left smiled and said that was fine, they just wanted to sit for a bit, it was a bad night to drive. Which, fair. I nodded and asked what they wanted. None of them answered. They were all looking at me, not staring, not in a threatening way, just looking, with the kind of sustained, unblinking attention you'd see in a photograph, not a living face. The man closest to me had a glass of water in front of him that I hadn't poured and hadn't seen appear. I said louder, "What can I get you all?" The woman smiled again. "We're all right," she said. Her voice was slightly too even, like someone who had practiced the sentence but not the music of it. I backed up toward the phone. I told myself it was nothing, some church group, some cult thing, some people who'd had a weird night and were a little out of it. I picked up the phone and started to dial Philip's cell just to have someone on the line. As I was dialing, I looked up at the bar. They were all looking at my reflection in the window behind the bar. Not at me, at my reflection. Each of them had oriented toward the dark glass, and they were watching my image in it with that same steady attention, and the man closest to me had tilted his head to an angle that was just slightly, just 5 or 10 degrees, past what a neck should allow, and he was watching my reflection with something that I can only describe as appetite. I walked out the back door. I left my keys inside. I stood in the rain in the employee lot for 40 minutes until Philip called me back, and I told him something vague about a gas smell, and he came in to check, and by the time he arrived they were gone. The next morning, all 4 bar stools they had been sitting on were turned to face the window, the backs lined up perfectly parallel. I had not moved them. No one had been in after I left. Philip asked me about it. I said I must have bumped them during closing. I didn't work there much longer after that. Not because anything else happened, nothing did. I just couldn't shake the image of 4 people watching my reflection like it was the real thing, and I was just something in the way. Story 5. The bar doesn't exist anymore. That might matter. I've thought about whether that matters, whether the thing that was in it went somewhere else when the building came down, or whether it's still there in some way in the footprint in the ground under the concrete. I think about that sometimes when I'm trying not to think about it. It was a place called the Silo, in a small farming community in the Nebraska Panhandle called Briar Flat. I'm being specific because I've always felt like being vague about these things is a kind of dishonesty, and I'm tired of being dishonest about what happened there. The bar had been built into an actual converted grain silo, cylindrical, concrete, about 40 feet in diameter, with the bar running in a half circle along the inner wall and tables filling the rest. The acoustics were strange. Sound didn't echo the way you'd expect. It absorbed somehow, and conversations from across the room arrived at a slight delay, like the words were being tasted before they reached you. I was there because of my sister. Her name is Renata, and she'd been living in Briar Flat with her partner for 2 years, and I'd been putting off visiting since she moved there, not out of hostility, just out of that particular passive avoidance that looks from the outside like laziness, but is actually anxiety in a trench coat. I finally drove out in September and spent 3 days sleeping on their pull-out couch, watching their dog knock things off the coffee table and eating the best homemade tamales I'd ever had. On my last night, Renata took me to the silo because she wanted to show me the place, said it had character. It had character. The owner's name was Ferdinand Vogt, which I remember because it was embroidered on his denim jacket. He was a small, neat man in his 60s with a white goatee and the careful movements of someone who had once broken something by moving too fast and learned from it. He served us himself, a local craft beer for Renata, a ginger ale for me since I was driving back early, and he asked how long I was in town, what I thought of the valley, whether I'd seen the old homestead properties on the North Road. Pleasant, nice man. The place filled up around 8 o'clock, and the sound of all those conversations absorbing into the curved concrete walls gave the room a low, soft quality, like being inside a ear. Here is where I want to be careful because I know how this sounds. I had ginger ale, I was sober. Renata was right there. At some point in the evening, after my second drink, after we'd talked about our parents and her garden, and whether she was happy out here, which she was, genuinely, I started hearing my own name. Not someone calling across the room for a different person with my name, not the approximation of it. My full name, the way my mother says it when she's worried, the exact cadence of it coming from somewhere on the other side of the room. I turned around, Nobody was looking at me. Nobody was pointed in my direction. I told Renata I thought I'd heard someone call me. She looked around, shook her head. It happened again 10 minutes later. My name, full name, the specific two-syllable weight of it spoken by a voice I didn't recognize, but which carried a quality of familiarity so precise that I almost answered. I almost said yeah before I caught myself. Ferdinand Vogt appeared at our table at that point. He set down 2 glasses of water we hadn't ordered, and he looked at me with a direct, neutral expression, and he said, "Are you hearing something?" "I think so," I said. He nodded very slowly. "Don't answer it," he said. "Whatever you do, don't answer it back." I looked at him for a long moment. "Has this happened before?" He picked up our empty glasses. "The building does that to some people," he said, which was not an answer to the question I asked. We left soon after. In the car, Renata was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I've never heard it, but a few people I know have. Ferdinand always tells them the same thing." "Don't answer," I said. "Don't answer," she confirmed. The silo burned down 14 months later. No cause determined. I saw it in a local news article online and sat with it for a long time, trying to decide how I felt. When I got home from that trip, I checked my voicemail before I went to bed. There was a message from an unknown number, left while I was driving, a 3-second clip of ambient noise. The kind of ambient noise from a room with strange acoustics, and underneath it, just barely my name. Said the way my mother says it. I deleted it. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. I don't know what the right thing would have been. Story 6. There's a bar in northern Minnesota called the Lake Watch, and the reason it's called the Lake Watch is that the back wall is entirely glass and looks out over a narrow lake that sits in a valley between 2 long ridges. In summer, the view is beautiful. In late November, when the lake is just starting to freeze from the edges inward and the birches are bare and the light goes gray and flat by 3 in the afternoon, the view is something else. Not ugly, just heavy, like the landscape is resting under something. I know that bar because my father used to take us there every fall when we drove up to close his family's cabin for the season. My brother Eric and I would get hot chocolates and sit at the window table while my dad and his cousins argued about the cabin's gutters for 3 hours. I always liked watching the lake. Even then, even as a kid, there was something about the way the frost worked at the edges, the way the ice would advance overnight when you weren't watching, and you'd come back the next day and more of the dark water would be gone. I was there alone this time. My father had been gone for 2 years, and I'd inherited the cabin, and I'd been going back every fall to close it up the way he used to, partly out of habit, partly because it felt wrong not to, partly because, I don't know, some part of me expected to find him there or find some trace of him I'd missed. I finished the cabin work by 4 and went to the Lake Watch, because where else was I going to go? The bartender was a woman named Solveig Back, who had worked there since I was a teenager and still had the same long silver braid and the same no-nonsense efficiency behind the bar. She remembered me, or said she did. She poured me a brandy I didn't ask for and nodded toward the window table and said, "Your table's open." The bar was quiet. A couple in the corner were eating dinner. An old man near the door was reading what looked like a very thick paperback. It was about 20 degrees outside, and the lake had gone about 60% ice overnight. I sat at the window and watched the open water at the center, that dark, ragged strip between the white. I had been sitting there for maybe 40 minutes when I noticed something on the frozen edge of the lake. At first, I thought it was a person. Then I thought it was a deer. The proportions seemed more animal than human, something about the width of the shoulders and the way the weight was distributed. Then I looked more carefully and I stopped being able to decide. It was at the waterline, the exact edge where the ice met the open water, and it was crouching. I say crouching, but that's not quite right. It was folded. Folded down in a way that suggested too many joints, limbs at angles that kept shifting as I watched, not violently, but restlessly, like a person who can't get comfortable in a chair. It was pale, the same pale as the ice, which is why I hadn't seen it at first. And it had its face, or what was where its face would be, pointed at the gap in the ice at the dark water below. I watched it for a long moment. I told myself it was a great blue heron gone still. I told myself it was a trick of the last light, which was going fast and turning everything blue and ambiguous. But herons don't have shoulders, and whatever this was had shoulders, and they moved when it breathed with a rhythm that was too slow, one breath for every 30 or 40 seconds, each one making its whole torso expand and contract like a bellows. I don't know how long I sat there before it turned and looked at the window. The distance was maybe 60 yards. The light was failing, but I could see that what I'd been reading as a face was a face, and it was watching me the way I'd been watching it, and it held very still in that moment, both of us across the water and the ice, and I had the feeling, I couldn't shake it, that it recognized me specifically, not as a person, as something it had been waiting to see. Solve appeared at my elbow. "Don't go down to the water tonight," she said, which was such a specific and deliberate thing to say that it cut through everything else. "What is it?" I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Something that comes up when the ice starts," she said. "When the water's half open, it doesn't like the full freeze, and it doesn't like open water. It likes the in-between." She put her hand briefly on my shoulder. "It'll go back down once everything's locked over, usually a few more days." I sat there for a long time after that. I didn't look at the lake again, not directly, but in my peripheral vision I kept sensing movement at the glass edge, and once I heard something tap the window. Not hard, just once, like a test. I slept at the bar that night, actually. Solve let me stay. She said some people do that this time of year. In the morning the lake was fully frozen. The lake watch looked out over flat white ice, birches, ridge lines, beautiful, heavy, like something resting under it. Outside my car door, in the frost on the driver's window, there were 3 parallel marks running from top to bottom, not scratched into the glass, but pressed into the frost from the outside, each one a clean trough maybe 2 inches long. I looked at them for a long time, then I drove home. I still close the cabin every fall. I still stop at the lake watch, but I watch the lake now. Not the way I used to watch it as a kid, with that comfortable child's appreciation for stillness. I watch it the way you watch something that knows you're there. I don't sit by the window anymore either. I let whoever wants that table have it. Thanks for watching. If these stories got under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe for more. We've got a lot more darkness ahead. Drop a comment below and tell me which story is going to be keeping you up tonight, and share this with someone who needs a good reason not to go out alone after dark. Until next time, stay safe, stay close to the light, and maybe don't sit at the end of the bar.